guys, it's your favorite pipeline nurse practitioner. If you've watched any of my videos in the past, you know that I am a huge blue-collar advocate when it comes to healthcare. I worked on the pipeline and ran the medical clinic for years. It was so clear to me that my guys were so underserved when it came to their healthcare, access to healthcare, people encouraging them to get healthcare. And so that's really why I started this. It's really evolved into occupational exposure stuff. One thing that's become clear to me as I study your job roles and what you're exposed to is there is very little literature or research specifically geared to blue-collar workers, even though you guys are highest risk for so many things. I had a patient recently that worked around metal, and I was concerned for manganism. So I've really been reading a lot about manganese exposure and manganism. And so I ran across an article specifically about welders exposed to manganese. And it's a really good study, and I think it's so important to share with you. So for welders, manganese is in so much. It's in steel, stainless steel, flux core welding, different welding rods, electrodes, and wires. And non-welders can be exposed to it when they're cutting or grinding. Manganese is essential to our body function, but we've known for a long time that excess manganese causes neurological disease that looks a lot like Parkinson's. Some of the clinical findings in people that have manganism or manganese toxicity is something they call a cock walk. It's kind of an awkward, high-stepping, stiff movement. There's actually something called manganese madness, and that's a distinct change in mood, increased irritability, impulsiveness, aggression, forgetfulness. And that's because when you breathe in those fine particles of manganese, it can actually go straight to your brain. One of the earliest signs of manganese toxicity in men can be erectile dysfunction and decreased libido. The article that I found during my research about manganism is from 2007. The primary researcher is Rosemary Bowler, and she's a neuropsychologist based out of California, and she does a lot of occupational neurotoxicity stuff. And it's a really good research article. It's small, but it's a really unique study. In 2004, the study took 43 male workers that were welding in confined spaces on the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. They were welding 28 anchoring foundations or piers consisting of steel piles and footing boxes. It took place below the bay's surface in unpressurized cofferdams. None of them had PPE, and there really wasn't any ventilation. In the first year and a half, 90% of the welders started to complain about their health and health concerns. Most of the guys were in their early to mid 40s, and it was determined that they were healthy and well prior to this job. They used manual shielded metal arc welding and automated flux core arc welding. And flux core, we know, has a lot of manganese in it. And this was reportedly their first time ever welding in confined spaces. So for this study, they actually took air quality samples by a third party, not the employer, during the build, and they tested the welders' blood. They did neuropsych testing, they did physical testing, they did all kinds of really good quality testing on these guys. The air quality study showed that the manganese in the air was higher than the OSHA limits, and that per OSHA and California OSHA, these guys should have been provided with respirators. Tremors, which is more prominent with Parkinson's and less so with manganism, was present in 39 to 90% of these guys. They tested them more than once. Motor dexterity and speed was impaired up to 95% of the time. And they speculated that because hand dexterity and speed is so important in welding, that welders should score higher than the average. So the fact that they were so much lower means it could have been much worse than it appeared. It looks like their IQ actually dropped 10 to 12 points, and the longer they were exposed, the more their IQ dropped. Once their job was over at the bridge, up to 81% of them complained of depression and anxiety that they hadn't had previously, and all but one of the 43 welders reported sleep and sexual health concerns, erectile dysfunction, and decreased libido. More than 3/4 of these guys had decreased ability to smell. 93% of them complained of respiratory concerns, and 20.9 months after they started working on the bridge, 1/3 of the welder group presented with mild obstructive airway disease. The study notes that the welders were exposed to this relatively briefly, so 16.5 months, and they speculate that that's probably short enough that once they were removed from the exposure, they can probably recover. As far as the blood testing goes, we know that manganese can be an unreliable blood test, mainly because, as this study says, you need to check the levels less than a month from the time you were exposed. So if you welded 6 or 8 weeks ago and you're having these types of symptoms, your blood test is probably going to be negative. So a normal manganese level in somebody who has manganese exposure doesn't mean it's actually normal. And that's actually because manganese stops floating around in your blood and it deposits in your brain and your lungs and wherever else. So it's in your body, it just isn't measurable in the blood. This study is incredibly informative and helpful. There are a couple gaps. It's small. It wasn't randomized. I did a natural experiment, which when you're in the blue collar trades, getting on site and doing the testing, that's where you find the info. But from a research perspective, that's not the most rigorous kind of study. And this really highlights that we need more studies about blue collar workers that are larger so we can compare the data. The call to action from this article, which I can't support more, is that welders should undergo medical and occupational screening for symptoms related to manganese exposure at minimum once a year. The appropriate regulatory agencies like OSHA should pay attention to these sites and make sure that the workers are getting the protection they actually need, and that air quality studies should be done regularly on a job. This recommends at least once a month. They say that the acceptable level of manganese per California OSHA is too high, and they should reconsider the permissible exposure level, specifically for welders, because the particulate welders are exposed to are fine and ultrafine, which get in farther into your body and cause more damage. I like this article so much because it highlights my personal concerns, which are blue collar workers are not studied enough, even though they're the highest risk. Blue collar workers are not always provided with the PPE that they should have. OSHA guidelines give employers levels of permissible exposure, but that doesn't mean it's safe. And as I say in almost all my videos, if you're a blue collar worker, you have to be responsible for your own health. You have to advocate for yourself, you have to protect yourself, and you have to be in charge of your own health. You deserve it. You don't deserve to sacrifice your health and well-being for a paycheck. And the most aggravating part is so much of this is preventable. Like always, ventilation when you're working, the appropriate PPE, and if you ever have weird symptoms, go see a healthcare provider or give me a call. My information's up there. I'd love to hear about your experiences and if you can relate to these guys in the article. Just know that I am thinking of you guys. I encourage you to take care of yourselves because you deserve it. Have a good one. I'll talk to you later.